Namaste to all of you. This is Anvi. Welcome back to my channel. One of the things that really interests and intrigues me is how an artist's mind works, how an artwork is created and the process behind it, and how an artist perceives and experiences life. I'm very happy to present the Soul Source Conversation series. As the name suggests, it is a series of unfiltered conversations and discussions dealing with all of those things. As my very first guest, I am very happy to have Annie Hayter with me, who is a writer and a poet based here in London. Annie has been a London Writers Awardee as well as a Barbican Young Poet. Annie's work has been shortlisted in several competitions, including the White Review Poets Prize, the London Magazine Short Story Prize, Desperate Literature Prize, the Bath Flash Fiction Prize, as well as the Sylvia Plath Prize. Thank you again for joining me here today, and I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. That is an amazing list of achievements you have.
Thank you. It feels a bit embarrassing to hear.
Every artist says that.
You said it.
How does it feel to be a poet?
It feels alive and exhausting. How does it feel for you?
Oh, the same, I guess.
Yeah.
So to start off with, shall we begin by hearing you recite one of your poems?
Yes. I'm going to read a poem called Grandpa Hallelujah, which is a kind of anti-eulogy for someone I was not able to meet. Grandpa Hallelujah. Whenever a bird craps on me, I know it's not luck trailing whitely on my sleeve. It's my grandfather, come, in fecal form to tell me exactly what he thinks of this newfangled world I'm living in. If our lifelines had intersected, my birth arriving before his timely death, he would have carved the sign of the beast onto the forehead that I grew, blooming out of my mother, broad-arsed, chin sharp. In the mirror, the crook of his nose resembles a steeple. He would have despised me as he did my mother. Our skinny shoulders make bus stops for the devil to sit in. You could hide a woman's face in them, or two. He forbade loving, sat fishing in the kitchen with God for sin. They discussed ecumenical matters long into the night, counting souls and money on the same dinner table. He chewed life with much the same vigour as his breakfast, 20 times over, snow fickling at the windows of his heart. It never rains in heaven. He watched my mother like he'd watch a thing with claws. In his home, she obeyed the 2 square rule. Toilet paper was precious in the eyes of the Lord. Waste was akin to murder. He tallied the sections of each roll, polished his Italian leather shoes, purchased 2 decades before, his little indulgence. His gaze still lingers from the mantelpiece, leathered with Methodist superstition. My mother kissed the corpse, the feeling of his cold lips twitching on her cheek.
Wow.
Thank you.
It was amazing.
Oh,
I remember when you sent the poem to me and I read it the first time, I had the kind of same reaction. It's such a personal and deeply felt poem.
Thank you.
And I picked out quite a lot from it. I think the first thing that struck me was the similarities within a family, the similarities of the narrator with her grandfather, the grandfather and his daughter, which is the narrator's mother. At the same time, there is also that sense of being different. So much so that there is that inherent fear of, would I be accepted in this family? Would I truly be a part of this family? And And you've explored that through the grandfather who is not alive
Mm-hmm.
at the time of the poem being written and recited.
Mm-hmm.
So, what prompted you to explore this in this particular tangent?
That's a good question. I think it's always really interesting having a conversation with someone who isn't there because they can't speak back to you. And so sometimes someone's death or someone's absence can give you a permission to express things that wouldn't have been possible if they had been alive. I don't know if I would exist if my grandfather had been alive at the point where I was conceived. So there's a kind of strange connection there between the gift of life that I received, which is kind of an odd way to think about it, I suppose. But I think there's something quite wonderful about taking the things that you do inherit, even if that's along with a good dollop of trauma and difficulty as well, and kind of transmogrifying that into something not necessarily beautiful, but something that is true to you. And I think poetry for me has always had that capacity of kind of distilling experience of a means to express things and understand things, whether that's within like the familial history or that particular context or in other ways as well.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so many lines stood out from it. And I think, as you said, that's one of the most beautiful things about poetry is like it distills stuff. And just 4 or 5 words and you have a completely whole new universe kind of open up. One of your lines that I really loved was, he sat with God and he forbade love, which when I read it I was like, wow, because usually God is somebody who you associate love with, and the ultimate kind of love, the most loving, the most all-encompassing, compassionate being. But here he's sitting with God and he's forbidding love. It's like a dichotomy. So what were you trying to express through that?
With the great questions. I think my relationship to God is a very complex one, because I was raised by a fallen Catholic. My grandfather was a Methodist who converted to Catholicism to be with my nana, my grandmother, and then became evangelical. So I guess in some ways my family went through a lot of different religious transitions, which I sort of experienced, laterally isn't quite the right word, but I experienced an inheritance. So I think I've always had quite a complex relationship to that. I suppose I think God can be so many different things, and I think spirituality can mean a lot of beautiful and different things, and as I grow older I'm developing kind of my own understanding to that and my own claim on what that means and what that can be, and like all the kind of wonderful capacities of that in a way. So I think I'm still kind of figuring it out. I'm very interested at the moment in researching saints' lives and researching the history of like popes, and thinking about kind of the different legends around miracles and, I don't know, lots of the different stories that we have about kind of God or his followers or her followers and disciples. So it's all a bit complex at the moment, but something I'm still trying to come to terms with, I guess. Yeah.
It's amazing. And you touched about the saints and all of that, which kind of ties into mythology. I'm sorry if it is a very far-flung question, but what does mythology mean to you? Like, what mythology do you refer to when you're writing poetry?
I think because I was a very curious child and I was really obsessed with reading books, my local library was in a swimming pool, as in the bookcases weren't literally in the pool, but it was a centre that was bisected by a pool and by a library, and the books always smelled like chlorine, so I would read really widely. I was really interested in, like, I guess, Greek myths, Indian myths, Caribbean myths. And so I think whilst I don't necessarily draw on all those different traditions in my writing, I'm very deeply interested in kind of maybe the mythology of the family and how we kind of deify different members of our families, how There are stories that are passed on, and with each era there's a kind of hyperbole that's added to the layers of the stories, and people have different perspectives on things that have happened. I think with a lot of the books I've read, the characters definitely take up space and residence in my head, so there's all kinds of different families of people that have discussion, whether that's in my dreams or like my waking life. So I think there's lots of different mythologies. I guess as a writer, and I'm sure you experience this too, like your own characters kind of have their own, you know, priorities and precedences that they occupy in your head. So,
Amazing. And I guess as a follow-up, where does language come in when you're exploring mythology? Because for me personally, because I am coming mainly from the Indian mythological background, and even as a dancer, former dancer, it feels very strange for me to express those mythologies or any inspiration from that in English per se. It feels so alien. I guess because originally they're all in either Sanskrit or any of the Indian languages. And for me to even write about my own childhood, you know, my own growing up years or anything like that in English feels really like as if I'm at a distance from it when I write in English. Because I guess the language doesn't gel in at all somehow. I don't know how I'm supposed to like get that bridge built up and how I'm supposed to go forward from that. But for you as a writer, and because you also take like, you know, Greek mythology, for example, and all of that, but I'm sure they must all be in like English translations or whatever. But how does language play a role in like kind of getting that into your own expressions?
Well, you've got me thinking about a lot. Just saying that, I think that's a really interesting question. I think for me personally, although I'm less polyglot than you are from what you just described, I guess there's something about finding your own language and how you manage to do that. I think for me, I'm very interested in neologisms, which is like a very long word, but for anyone who's not familiar with it, it just means making up new words or creating new words. And I'm quite interested in how we create verbs, how we make new coinages, how that kind of arrives, and how we also, I don't know, forge our own sense of, I don't know, an idiolect or a sense of self. Like, I think people talk a lot about having an original voice, or like having a unique thing, which I think, I don't even know what that means. I think that's very, very difficult to do, because I think I'm so much a child of all the different things I've read, of all my friends, of my family, of the things I've watched or engaged with. That all kind of percolates in the brain, doesn't it, and creates a very rich history that we all each individually have, even if we're not always able to access that. And I think it's interesting because in my teaching practice, because I also run workshops and teach English, literature and language, I'm always really invested in this idea of the capacity for listening to other people and how that can sometimes give people permission to say things they might not otherwise be able to express, or even to use language that they might not be given permission to use in certain spaces as well. I think that's quite important too. So yeah, something about speaking, but also being heard or engaged with in some way.
I love the way you said we have like histories built up. I guess at the end of the day, we all become mythologies ourselves.
Yeah.
Right? In whatever small way.
I love that. That's so beautiful. Yeah.
So, in the modern day context, what is the one mythology that you're trying to create or build or follow? Or
yeah. Oh, I don't know. I guess at the moment I'm writing about a figure called Pope Jane, who, for anyone who's not familiar with this person, they or he or she or whatever pronoun you want to use, was someone who allegedly existed in around the 9th century as a pope. They were elected as a pope until they gave birth on a papal procession in Rome, and became like this figure of gender flux, gender fluidity. There's a lot of ambiguity about who they were. Obviously, we can't really impose a modern understanding of gender on that era, although, you know, colonialism and Christianity and other forms of oppression have done a lot to reduce the very complicated understandings of gender that we have across the globe. But I guess I'm quite interested in thinking about, I don't know, this particular European figure within their framework of Christianity and kind of imagining what their life was like and putting them in a more modern context, and kind of thinking about just making up different stories about them and what they lived and what their life was like, because I mentioned the saints' lives before, and there are a lot of stories about people assigned female at birth or women of their era dressing as men, living as men, succeeding as men, and there are so many examples of people like this, across the globe, across thousands of years, existing in this way between gender or as a certain gender. So I guess I'm quite interested in kind of thinking about different forms of queer history, thinking about that erasure, and how we create spaces or create histories where they have been destroyed, systematically destroyed. And it's very, very hard to write to that sometimes, but I think even if sometimes it's difficult not to get things wrong, it's important to try in a way and like experiment with that. Great question.
In a way, you're saying that everything that we talk about in the present day, it wasn't that it is something new. Everything already existed throughout mankind's history, because human beings are the same no matter what. But it's just that certain parts of them were invisible at certain eras and at certain periods.
I think that's definitely a dimension of it. I think it's so hard to know, really, because what we rely upon is written history. That's often very shaped by men, and that's very shaped by whiteness in some contexts, or a lot of records that we have been destroyed systematically, so we don't have accesses to huge bodies of work that do exist. So I think it's really hard to know. In my particular understanding of more medieval European history, the treatment of history and records and recording, it's very people would insert themselves into the narrative. There are dragons flying around. Someone might be writing about an event 200 years earlier and say, and then I heard them say this, and you think, well, that sits a bit strangely. So I think in a modern context where we have, we have the internet, and we have records, and we have technology, and all this capacity, and the enormous amount of things that we have on record and data already, it's interesting, I guess, looking at something from an era where actually records are fluid. The things people chose to write down were very particular and biased in the way that they are now. But we don't necessarily have set versions of the truth, maybe, in the same way that we can sort of say we do now. But even that is a matter of perspective, isn't it? So, I think it's sort of hard to know, but I think we do have records of people existing. There's been a lot of work that's been done to crush that out and destroy that and efface that. But also there's a lot of oral tradition where people have, stories that have survived through time. Even if our education systems, and I'm speaking particularly in a UK context, seek to not reveal that and seek to not give people access to that information and that representation of different parts of history. So I think, not to sound really conspiracist about it, but I think, there is so much that we are not given access to, and a lot of things are privileged. And that can be quite terrifying, I think, coming to terms to that as a young writer and sort of figuring, how do I address that? Because it feels monolithic even.
And that's a huge responsibility as well, isn't it, to take on something like that? But at the end of the day, as an artist, and especially as a writer, because words travel down, it's like written records.
Literally.
Kind of, the responsibility is more as well. And these works about Pope June, is it like a collection of poetry?
Yeah, I think it's sort of at the moment it's kind of like experimental writing. So there is a lot of poetry in it. There's some fragments of prose. I'm kind of interested in how we try and lineate a life in writing. And so I think I'm quite interested in kind of crossing genres and crossing forms. At the moment I have about 50 pieces of text that I'm kind of threading together and assembling together. So it feels like a collection. Whether it's poetry or not, I'm not I'm not quite sure.
Sure.
It's coagulating.
Amazing. Before I go to the next question, to kind of finish off with the Grandpa Hallelujah poetry, would it be wrong to say that at the end of the day, the grandfather is kind of like a mythology to you?
Yeah, I think so. Because I feel that ghost and I feel that presence with me in the way that I guess my grandfather sort of becomes a cipher for the patriarchy or homophobia or lots of other kinds of phobias or oppression. So I guess it does, and in a way that's the gift that I've been given in ways that I can do that, because I mean I guess some members of my family might argue with that and disagree with that, but fundamentally this is my truth, that's their truth, that's okay.
Absolutely.
Those can exist at the same time.
Absolutely, there's more than enough space for everything.
Yeah. Multiplicity.
Yes, in the true sense.
Yeah.
I think that brings me to the next question. So another thing you write about is queer desire. Where does that stem from?
Wow, it comes from my desire.
I love that.
Yeah, I think it's a really complicated thing thinking about. I come from like a very open-minded inner family, if not my external family. But when I was growing up in school in London in the noughties, like it was a difficult environment to be, I think, as a young queer person. And I'm a very privileged person in many, many, many respects as well. But I think the homophobia and his intersectionality with other forms of oppression was just so densely knitted into the fabric of my school life. The way people were treated, the way people were bullied, the hierarchies of that. And I think it was really hard when I was younger to kind of just exist as I was. I always felt quite odd and quite strange, and people would tell me that as well, which I think is very understandable because that's the way teenagers react, and I think children, are forced sometimes to act out their parents' behaviours or the structures of society at large, really. But I think it's just really important to me, I guess, to create that space where we do talk about this kind of stuff and this feeling, this emotion, but actually the joy and the celebration of that. And I think a lot of my friends and peers at the moment are doing that too, like, speaking to something that hasn't been expressed, maybe in different formations and with different contours of intimacy, to what they're saying and from their own experiences. But yeah, I think desire is such a beautiful thing, and it's so hard to articulate what you want. And I think particularly if you've been socialised as a woman, like, it's often just really didn't know, I know, literally. But I think it can be really incredibly difficult to actually be able to say those things, and that's not just like on an intimate or a sexual level. That can relate to so many different strata of your life and layers of your experience. So I think, trying to even find the language for that is complicated. But it's a joy as well. It's a beautiful thing.
But it's so interesting. It's surprising how we work so much on assumptions. Because you said it was difficult for you growing up like here in London, but people come to London escaping other countries. So
I know, and like I should also say, like, there are so many things that I'm so grateful for in London, and it is a beautiful, multiple, mellifluous kind of place in so many ways too. But I also think there are kind of strange parochial like subcultures that you can find, and it's always really interesting how that translates, and how even people who kind of profess to be really liberal aren't necessarily, and there's a lot of hypocrisy that can kind of go on in certain spaces. So it's a really layered thing. I think things have changed a massive amount in the past few years in some ways, and also not in other ways. So it feels strange because we're sort of at the axes of like radical change in some ways, but then a lot of like institutions haven't changed at all and don't really want to, aren't really willing to put the work in. And that can feel quite frustrating, I think, sometimes, especially as a young artist that wants to contribute to that change and that shift. Sometimes it's hard to find the pathways through which to do that, I suppose. Yeah.
I also love the way you said, it came from such a place of understanding that, at that time, the people that were reacting badly to you or whatever, they were doing it because they were conditioned that way. It's
Totally. And we were all young. There are all things we've done when we're younger.
Yeah.
It's not a culpability thing. There should be space for people to change and grow. Fundamentally, we weren't given the models to operate within. So how else are children meant to learn? I think that's why representation now and creating those spaces for children to express themselves and explore things and to experiment and not to be judged for that is so vital.
Absolutely.
Particularly in writing as well.
Yes. Yeah, I think writing, personally, I feel like writing is the most powerful art form. Absolutely, yeah, because I feel like it can affect society on the largest scale possible, and it does it in a very noiseless manner. It doesn't it's so noiseless, it's so subtle, and it's like it changes one person at a time, and it kind of creates that undercurrent of change, I guess. And writing wise, you write poetry and fiction as well. And I've recently read one of your pieces.
Have you?
I did. This was Desperate Literature.
Yeah.
Which does talk about a lot of things that we spoke about until now, like language and history and all of that. Yeah. So could you tell us about that piece a little bit more and your process and all that?
Oh, I love that you found that. And so the piece Anvi is referring to is called Mildewed, like the word mildewed, but separated with dashes. And it's it's like an attempt at a medieval forgery, basically. So it's kind of considering this idea that, again, thinking about stories, the way that they filter through time, and the story takes 3 different perspectives, or 4 different perspectives, I think, of different people approaching a medieval story or a medieval myth and kind of talking about it. But what I really specifically wanted to do with the voices was create really annoying voices, like the kind of voices in academia that really annoyed me when I was studying for my degree, just speaking in a really horrible way about, because the story focuses on a woman called Dorcas Hidebound, who lives in the mud in the woods, and she's escaped her husband, and she's at one with the birds and the bees. And it's all a bit strange. But I was kind of interested in this idea of how do we take that history and warp it, and how do we also kind of testify to erased history? How do people, when they're given the capacity to write, what do they create? And how is that sometimes taken away from them in the act of that kind of liberation through the voice, I think.
Interesting. So coming to language itself, and we just spoke about how powerful a medium it is. And as writers, I guess there are 2 ways to look at it. One is the content of what you write about, and the other is the technicality of language itself. So for you, what is more important? Is it about, obviously what you write about is important, but is it also something that you look at, in terms of expanding the limitations of language, or what it can do, how it can be presented, and things like that?
I think there's so much there. I think I'm not always sure what it is I'm trying to do as I'm doing it or as I'm writing it. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I have a phrase in my head, and then things spring from that. I suppose my overall intention is to offer different meanings to people, and to have the understanding that what I write might mean something very, very different depending on who's listening to it. I'm interested in the technicality of things. I think drafting is really important. I'm very invested in speaking my work as much as having it on the page. I think that makes a big difference, particularly when you're editing. I don't know how you feel about this on performing your work as well, but there's a sort of different manifestation of that, and that's always quite intriguing to see that play out. But I think language is a slippery thing often. And often I think it's interesting that the things that you really love might not be the strongest things. You know, they say that phrase like "kill your darlings," and it's just so true, because I'm very visceral, I'm very hyperbolic. You can tell that from the way I speak. And sometimes I'm very polysyllabic because I really love long words.
I love them too.
I love them so much.
And long sentences. So
That's
we can taste the words of
yum, delicious words. But I think there's also, there's a fine line also between words for the sake of words, loving the joy of words, and also language that can be intimidating and exclusionary. I think that's a very complex subject, and it's not always an easy one to parse or understand, but there is something about how we use language in a way that is playful and fun and experimental, but also inclusive, also not intentionally dense, because I think that's something I feel a bit uncomfortable with sometimes. I know I've maybe read books before and felt a little bit like, is there an element of intentional exclusion here? Or I don't know, I think it's a really complex thing, and different books are for different people, that's also okay. You can pitch things to different markets and different audiences, that's totally fine. But I think particularly when there have been, years where certain kinds of books have not been permitted, or certain kinds of language have not been allowed or excluded, that becomes very complicated, and you can get a bit of a strange hierarchy. So I don't know. Yeah. Long answer.
Lovely answer.
To your question. Yeah.
Amazing. And is being accessible important to you? And I guess kind of tied up to it is the other part of the question. Is writing a form of, I don't know if protest is the right word, protesting, or is it something political for you, or not at all?
Very layered. I think accessibility is really important to me. I'm also aware that accessibility means a lot of different things to different people, and the ramifications of that are really enormous. And I think there are so many permutations to that. It's something you have to think really carefully about. So I guess it really depends on what kind of accessibility you're going for. But yeah, I think it is important to me, and it's something I think about, and it's something I need to learn more about. And it feels like a continual journey, really, figuring those things out and kind of how that manifests itself. The second part of your question, in terms of writing as a political or protest act, I think it certainly is. I think it's always a complicated question, because to some extent, I feel like maybe all writing is political or has the capacity to do that, and that also depends on like the cultural context of the writing too, of course. But I think, I was a very obnoxious child. I didn't shut up. Blabbermouth. So yeah, speaking certainly a form of protest. But I'm also aware that there's something about the fact that in the act of speaking, sometimes that can silence other people. And so there's a really fine line, I think, between speaking as an act of protest, but also how you include other people's voices, how you uplift other people and give them that space as well. Because I think protest, it has to be a collaborative thing. It has to be rooted in community, and it has to be rooted in, lots of people working together in that way. So I think it depends. I kind of love the idea that books and poetry and writing can be in conversation with each other, and I certainly feel that, we have sometimes such an idea of the artist as the individual and this person doing it by themselves, when more often people are very situated in friendships or certain communities, and that's certainly, I'm so privileged to have writer friends or artist friends, or people who aren't necessarily in the writing world but are, invested in the act of protest or teaching. So all those things kind of, I think, work together to create or try and deepen that understanding. Yeah.
It's a never-ending journey.
Yeah, no.
It's like,
Totally. How do you feel about that question?
To an extent, yes. I feel like writing about your most personal things itself is a kind of protest. And I guess, as you said, for different writers, it is different things because they function according to the time that they are in, the culture that they are in, and all of that. And I guess you also asked me about how I feel about speaking my work. I tried it for a while, which is where we met.
Yes.
But I feel like I need writing to be something more tangible, tactile. Probably because I've done the performance bit too much all my life. And so personally for me as an artist to kind of perform poetry as well, it's just putting an extra layer to it, which for me doesn't really do the job, I guess. I love listening to people talk because it gives me that sense of tactility within my mind because I'm hearing to it. Instead of like reading out, something written in my head, I'm listening to it and I can enjoy that. But for me to speak it out, it doesn't really add anything much. Unless it is like a monologue or something like that, then fine. But I love poetry when it is just poetry on the page, something that I can hold and smell and,
So it's a very sensory engagement. That's really, really interesting. I'm very interested, I guess, in the fact that you're also a classical dancer and how that aligns or how that works with the act of that embodying of like language and of words.
Yeah.
How do you feel those two things work together, if they do, in your mind?
They did to a very big extent because Indian classical dance, unlike Western dance, which is based on music only, is based on poetry. Indian dance is all about poetry in Sanskrit, Tamil, Kannada, all the Indian languages. So you have to understand poetry, you have to understand the lyrics of what you're expressing. It could be you're admiring nature, or it could be a love poem, or it could be a devotional poem. But you'll have to understand. I guess my appreciation for words kind of unconsciously grew from there, where I had to okay, there are 3 words, but each word, my expression has to be different. So how do I go about doing that? That's where I started dissecting words and stuff like that, I guess. So, and I've always been a reader since my childhood. Turning point for me was when I read, might sound like a very big cliche, when I read Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. I think that really opened my eyes to the power of literature. It was it can literally, as I said before, it can literally change societies. And that's when I started taking writing seriously. In English. It wasn't a pre-decided thing that, okay, I'm going to write in English. It just came naturally to me and I just continued doing that, I guess. And now it's only writing that matters. I don't relate to my body the way I used to as a dancer. Which I don't know why, but I just don't. So I guess that sense of having an abstraction within something tactile really inspires me.
That's so beautifully expressed.
Thank
and
you.
interesting. And I think we were saying before about things being journeys, but I guess things are always a process of transition.
Absolutely.
And actually, we're always unfurling in different ways, aren't we? And channeling ourselves into different embodiments or versions of ourselves. And it seems like you're doing a lot of really exciting things with your writing as well, which are expansive and moving into different spaces.
Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Yeah. Oh, very beautiful.
Thank you. On that note, having spoken so much about language, can we hear another of your poems?
Yes. So, actually thinking about what we were discussing before, this one is called We Were Constant Together. And it's very much, I suppose, about an idea of how you love someone or how you can love someone in a way that can feel very hyper-visible. And kind of the difficulties of that, and I don't want to use the phrase trials and tribulations because that is such a classic idiomatic one. But I think it is that sort of thing in the sense that we have peaks and troughs when we love. And that's not always an easy thing or a fun thing, but it is worthwhile. So yes, I'll do it now. We were constant together. Lay as we slept, clicking saints' names in our ears. I watched her wash her hair. I need it. I need her. She said, "They will put you in the ground and throw soil over you. You must pretend to be dead, for God willed it so to bid obedience to the higher form. The dead sun wrecked us all so gleefully, and we boiled our wedding dresses hand in hand, then cropped our hair as close as breath. I love that of what I love. I love all that you are. For you, I love. I am so jealous I could spit at all the men who stare at you. Pigs in broth, walking potato sacks, who lack the discretion that your grace demands. Collectors of the world, fleas and worms gnaw their way to holy. How many hairs have I plucked off your jacket? How many kisses on your dear feet? I love that of what I love. I love all that you are. For you are love. The first time you bit me, I bit back, and hard. Learnt to sleep in the positions you liked, to see how you felt at rest. Now we begin our flight, shaven, bound, rising.
Wow.
Oh, thank you.
I love how even in this poem there are these layers of mythology and everything so beautifully interwoven together. What was your inspiration? Again, a far-flung question, vague maybe, but what was your inspiration or like the starting point of this poem? Where did it come from?
Yeah, I saw an exhibition of the work of two artists called Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, who had a very complicated relationship, quite strange. I won't go into a lot of detail about it because
you can Google it.
It's a lot, basically. But they took a lot of photographs of each other, and they were both people who dressed in quite a transmasculine way, presented themselves in different ways. And were kind of very much together in an era where that wasn't considered acceptable or it wasn't perceived in the way we might understand it now. And looking at the images of them, I was just really interested in this idea of how we abstract love sometimes with people, what that means, and kind of almost some of the. When I say violence, I mean that in a kind of the energy and the strength and the vitality of being in a relationship with someone, not physical violence, but it's kind of like a psychic rendering, really, to be a person in the singularity of yourself, at least outside of your family or friends or community. Like, what does it mean to actually be with someone, and what compromises are being made, what's the uncomfortability, like, what is it about you this person kind of delights and annoys, because often there is a massive element of irritation when you really love someone. There's all the different things they'll do that will make you irascible, basically. So I was kind of interested in expressing that, and also kind of that idea of like just really going for it. Like, I love that. I love all that you are, for you love. It's like, I don't know, sometimes I think in the modern dating world and the romance scene, we're often like really encouraged to dampen down our feelings and not be clingy, and I totally get that, and people have a different attachment styles, and that's totally okay. But I was kind of interested in like going like the whole hog the other way, like how do I express the love that I have for someone and what that means, and actually the challenges that presents, because it isn't, as you were saying as well, like it isn't a straightforward thing. It can feel very easy for me to just sit here and talk about these things, that it's taken me a really long time to get to that place, and for so many people to get to that place of actually being able to talk about this in a casual way, in an offhand way. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what I loved about the poems, the casualness of it. It doesn't pretend to be something it isn't.
Yes.
It's just, okay, this is what I am, and here you are.
Literally.
Yeah.
And I think it's also kind of an interesting thing because I think being in a queer relationship, the way you can move through public spaces, often quite an interesting one, like because you're almost kind of trying to slightly, not necessarily intentionally, but I think a lot of us maybe slightly try and fit into heterosexual paradigms of how you relate to each other, and it's really hard not to feel a little bit confined to that. But even, you know, just walking down the street or like holding hands with someone or being affectionate with someone, that can become a really contested thing, and it's not uncomplicated, so it kind of, you know, it's sort of part of that as well. It is a casual thing. It isn't that deep, but it also kind of like it could be. It's you know, depends on the moment, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So coming to our final segment, I have a bowl of random words written. So they're all taken from like a Google word generator. And what we're going to do is we're going to pick out random shits and just talk about whatever the words are.
You spoke about dissecting language before.
Yes.
And I love that you've cut words up and put them in a bowl. The metaphor comes alive.
And I've made the other dancers do this as well.
Love it. Even better.
Yeah.
Ooh, okay. Can I?
Yeah, you can shuffle it.
Okay. Ooh, oh, no, sorry. Oh, fear.
Ooh, heavy.
Fear, big one. Oh, what comes to mind with fear? I think it's I think it's always interesting, particularly as an artist at the beginning of your career, because I don't know about you, but for me, because it feels like I'm at this kind of start of something. It's very easy to not have confidence and to have a sense of imposter syndrome. And to kind of have anxiety about what can become rather than celebrating what is. It's like, I think because there's sometimes such a pressure and like, you've got to be a young artist and like if you're under 35, do you know what I mean? It's like people get a particular amount of acclaim and that's something I feel quite strongly. How about you?
I feel the opposite actually.
Really? Ooh.
When I start doing something like a creative work, I'm extremely excited and I'm so confident and I do it, and once I finish it, I just start hating it.
Really?
And I think it does come from fear.
Yeah.
Because I just feel like I haven't given it enough.
Yeah.
Haven't done good enough. So that's one thing I really grapple with, which results in me not putting out my work as much as I can or as much as I should. I just end up holding back a lot of things. Create, and then just, that's it.
That must be really difficult. I think one thing I would say is that I think, and maybe this isn't a helpful thing to say in respect of what you just said, but sometimes I think it is really good to give yourself the time and space for something to sit and percolate. And it must be really difficult having that feeling of rejecting what you've done, but maybe there's something about giving it 6 months and seeing if you can have more compassion.
Probably.
I don't know, because I think for me, like often I'll look at things in a bit of time and then I'll see things that I didn't see before and I'm perhaps less sensitive to it. Sometimes I write things and then I'll forget I've done it and I'll come across it and it just doesn't feel like, it's like I've dissociated it from being me, and that can be useful sometimes, even if it's frightening as well.
Okay.
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, usually I just end up hating it more after some time.
So that's totally not useful.
So,
yeah.
Very heavy words. Grief.
Yeah.
Grief. I think it really ties into what we just spoke about.
Yeah.
I grieve my artworks a lot. So for me, I think that's the definition of grief right now, at this point in my life, is for all the works that I've created but have not done anything with them. And I don't necessarily mean like getting them published or winning a prize or putting them in a festival or anything like that. but just that sense of me acknowledging them is also not there. So I think that's kind of, yeah, that's my definition of grief at this point, I guess. What do you do with artworks that you personally reject, or do you reject any of your own works at all?
Oh, all the time. All the time. But one thing I'd say, just to pick up on what you just said, is that you are acknowledging them now. So by talking about them, you're bringing them into the space. I feel like sometimes when I'm asleep in bed, I have like all my rejected things in bed with me.
That's so sweet.
You know, like, because I when I was a child, I used to sleep with books by my head. I don't know, just so I could read them when I woke up. And today I just sleep with a notepad so I can write things down when I wake up. And so I really hear that. I think sometimes it's very difficult, but what I try and see things as is recycling, repurpose things, or process, and to know that nothing is ever wasted. Like, it's all contributing to something. And it's all part of, again, we were talking about this before, but like this trajectory, this journey. I think we can have a very teleological approach to things where it's like, the end point has to be this and it has to be that. But I think that's not always a useful like hierarchy to impose on yourself. I think for me, grief means a few different things. I think I feel a lot of grief for different things in my life. I think I'm coming to terms with some difficult things around abuse, like in my childhood, in my past, in my adulthood. And sometimes that can be like a really hard thing as a writer, because as you were talking about before, you know, stuff is like very personal, and of course it informs what we write about and what we share, and that can feel really exposing. But I'm trying to, I guess, understand that grief is a really powerful force as well, and to celebrate that in a way. I think for me, grief is like so linked with death, and I think death is, I don't know, at least when I was growing up, was just not something that was really spoken about in a direct way. And I think it would be really helpful if we did that a bit more too.
Not to sound arrogant, but I don't know, touch wood, but I've not had a very close experience with death so far. I mean, obviously, people I know have died and all of that, but until now it's not affected me in a way that it usually affects people. So I don't know if that's a very arrogant thing to say.
I think it's arrogant at all. It's honest.
It's just what my experience has been.
I don't know. When I was a child, my mother did something so beautiful. Which I think I've had different versions of. I'm not sure where she got the idea from, but she got us to write about some of the bad things that had happened, and we wrote them on pieces of paper and then we burnt them as children. And that was
That's beautiful.
so incredibly powerful. Like, I can't even say. I think sometimes that's a wonderful thing about different rituals that we might have, because they can sometimes give you that permission to maybe not put something to bed, but like to find a safe and healthy way of processing that. In a way, I think people put a lot of emphasis on things like therapy and psychoanalysis, and that stuff is great and helpful and really important. But I also think in some places people have maybe lost some of those rituals, or those have been erased, because there were ways that people had of dealing with things and processing things that have been stolen or destroyed. And we need more of those.
Absolutely. And it's so funny, we always keep talking about, oh, the society doesn't allow us, or the world doesn't allow us, but so many things we ourselves don't allow ourselves. It really hit me when you said, give ourselves the permission to kind of, it's like, wow, we don't give ourselves permissions for so many things.
So many, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think that's so true. And I think it's hard for us to do that if we don't have a paradigm for what that looks like. But I guess only we can try and start to do that, and try and start to model that for other people, and acknowledge that. Like, it's so difficult. I think sometimes it's hard with like places like Twitter and Instagram, because people are people seem so vulnerable and open and honest, and that feeds the algorithm in a way that I think is quite dangerous, in that people are encouraged to share trauma in a space that isn't necessarily safe or open. Sometimes it's amazing communities on Twitter, sometimes it's a really fantastic place for that. But also I think it becomes difficult because sometimes we get very, very used to certain patterns for ways of disclosing things or ways of sharing language that aren't actually necessarily natural to us, or the things that work for us. So yeah.
Okay, and the final word, each.
Do you want to start or shall I?
I can start.
Sorry, I'm a scaredy cat.
No, it's perfect. We can end with you. Okay, really heavy words.
Loyalty.
I think the definition of loyalty and what it means has changed a lot.
That's really interesting. How do you think it's changed?
Specifically in terms of relationships, I don't think it's as important now as it was before.
Yeah, I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
I think it's I suppose in a world of social media and technology and connection, the way we connect with people has so radically changed.
Yeah.
Like even in London, the way most of the people I know date, whatever their sexuality or background, for the most part, not everyone, but for the most part, a lot of people I know use dating apps now, and that seems like a totally different way of relating to people. And I guess with like the way we even speak to people and engage is so like technologically filtered, isn't it? So it's maybe it's harder to be loyal with the stimulation,
the
attention, distraction economy, attention economy, like.
But even then, at the end of the day, I feel like there has to be some solid ground within oneself, and especially when you're building a relationship with someone else, has to be there. And I guess in a generic sense, loyalty towards your art form is, I think more than anything, loyalty towards yourself is most important.
That's very, very true. I wonder what a loyalty to oneself means.
And I just threw it out there just like that.
I know, I'm like, how does that work? Because it's complex, isn't it? How do you because we change so much, don't we? I don't know. Maybe, so it makes me think of New Year's resolutions, right? Because you do something at the beginning of the year, you look at it back at the end of the year, you're like, I didn't do any of that, but it's all that counts. So maybe, I don't know, how do we make New Year's loyalties?
Oh gosh. Is that a way? Is that the, I don't know.
I don't know what I would be doing. Shall I pick
the last one.
The last one. Okay. Excited. I like this game very much. Companionship. I think writing is a bit like a companion, isn't it?
Absolutely. The best companion.
The best. It's like a little creature on your shoulder. It's a funny kind of conduit, isn't it? And an outlet. I mean, I've got so many notebooks, it's a bit appalling. I think I've got about 16 or something just by the side of my bed. But I do really like, I know it's so pretentious, isn't it? But and I don't buy really expensive notebooks or anything because I'm like terrified of losing them. But I do like that thing of having something that you can write in and like.
I'm the same. I have a huge hoard of
Poundland,
any diary you see, different colours.
Poundland, TK Maxx if you want to go a little bit nice.
Sometimes Sainsbury's when they have the sales and stuff.
Yeah, Wilko's quite good as well. I store up notebooks like I'm like a little magpie. I'm like £3, thank you, shiny.
Exactly.
Different notebooks for different purposes. I used to have until this year I had a brick phone. I got a smartphone for the first time this year, and that was fantastic because it meant that if I wanted to write something down, if I had a thought, I had to do it really concisely.
Right.
But that was actually amazing because I'd go through my phone drafts and I'd have 100 drafts of like these weird little ideas that I'd written down on my brick phone, but they were all really specific and to the point, and I think my writing has lost something by not having my brick companion. I miss it. How about you? What does companionship mean?
It can be one of the most beautiful things if it is on the same level with both the people. I'm talking about people here. Yeah, I guess. And it's today's world, again, not to sound pessimistic, but it's really hard to find that a satisfying, a fulfilling sense of companionship.
Yeah.
It's become very rare, unfortunately. And again, that's because of social media, because we relate and communicate mostly through social media and through apps and phones and whatnot. So that sense of physicality is missing. So how do you develop companionship? Even if it is a friend, even if it is your own parents,
Yeah.
where is that? It's not through a Zoom call, is it?
Oh, it's so tricky, isn't it? Because I feel like I came across a philosophical concept recently called pharmacon. Have you come across it? It's basically just this idea of something that is both a cure and that is a harm at the same time. So it's an interesting term medically because it applies to treatments that are harmful and helpful.
Yeah.
And I think for me, social media is a bit of a pharmacon in the sense that I love being connected with my friends all the time. Like I spent about an hour this morning in bed just messaging my friends and sending memes and videos and stuff, and that was lovely. And I felt, I love sending people voice notes. That's such a beautiful way to maybe monologue at people a little bit, but it's also very great because you have those updates. But it also it can really detract from that physicality, that embodied presence, and so it's wonderful and it's difficult, isn't it? And I wouldn't be rid of it, but I wish I could change my companionship with social media.
Oh, yeah, that's a nice one. But for me, companionship, I really feel like I'm born in the wrong era.
Do you?
I would have loved to develop that sense of friendship or companionship through letter writing, for example, and then just physically being present. That it makes so much of difference, the gestures of somebody, the way they smile, the sound of the voice, and all of that, the fragrance.
It's such a thing, isn't it? There's so many elements that make up a person. And I think I'm very invested in the way I type really terribly, just lots of typos. I just I slap the keyboard basically. But I kind of love that I actually have a very specific idiolect and voice when I write. So part of me is like, I love talking to people on social media. Yeah. But I hear what you're saying. You can still write letters though.
But nobody's
I wrote my friend a letter last week, so.
Okay. So maybe you'll get one from me and you'll be forced to reply back.
And I look forward to it with excitement. We've just talked about so much.
Yeah, I know.
And I feel like we've covered a
so
lot of ground.
So much,
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, of course, totally my pleasure. Thank you all so much. Hope you have enjoyed today's episode. Namaste.
They will put you in the ground and they will throw soil over you. You must be dead. Oh, sorry, could I do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay.
White Review Poets Prize, the Young Poets, Young People's Laureate for London. White Review Poets Prize, Young Laureate.
I'm excited. This is such a cool idea. Ooh, okay. So the word is, you probably won't see it, but it's soothe.
Oh, sorry. Can we do another?
Yeah,
because I did this for another dancer. Sorry, I should have taken the chit off.
No, it's fine.
This came for Suhani as well, didn't it?